Hey everyone, how are you? Good to be back. Let me turn up this microphone a little bit. Really good to be back. Nice to be on at a slightly earlier time. And we have an absolute marathon to get through if we want to do most of this tonight. That's why I sort of looked at it and I was like, I don't think this can wait till tomorrow because there's just so much that needs to be done. It would be difficult to try and do this in one show, for 2 days. I was like, "Oh, I don't know about that." I was like, I don't know if I can do such a thing." But it is good to see you. Good to see everyone. Yeah, everyone heard that I busted my eye. You can kinda see it on the side there. They've done something to it to push it together or something. Yep. Was trying to get changed for bed last night after the show, and I put my foot into my, like, pajamas, and I stepped, half asleep and just running on fumes. I didn't I don't know, I just didn't think that I thought my feet were under me, but they weren't, and I just went "boosh" like that, and I hit the entertainment center, like, the thing you put your TV on. I hit the corner right on my eyebrow here on the right near the temple, just smack. Woke up on the ground, and I just had there was just blood everywhere, and I just had to figure it out. There's no one here. There's no one here right now, and I just had to sort of figure out what to do. Got the bleeding to stop, antiseptic it, and then I went to sleep, and that was probably a dumb idea because I may have had a concussion. But I was so tired I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I had to do something to get some rest, and I took the risk to get some sleep. And then I woke up with blood all down my face, and I was like, I'm probably gonna have to go get this checked out. So yeah, got it checked out. They think it's healing okay now. They said they didn't think it needed stitches, but they just crimped it together with those spiky, plasticky things. It was about 18 hours ago. It was about 1 a.m. in the morning last night after I finished all my stuff up for the streams. I got something to eat, shut everything down, and I was about to go to bed. So yeah, about 18 hours ago. Let's see if I get a black eye out of it. Actually, the doctor was surprised. He's like, "I'm so surprised you don't have a like black shiner of an eye right now." He's like, "You should have an absolute crazy black eye," and he's like, "You don't." And he's like, "That's very strange." But let's hope that doesn't happen because I won't look as pretty on my live stream. Like, how's that supposed to work? I have to be on here every night. So, all right, there's your update on how I messed my face up. I'm gonna have like a giant scar, like right here. Great. I have to talk to my like $1 million plastic surgeon on how to fix that. Yeah. I was just running last night. I was running on gas, like just fumes, burning the candle at both ends, and it just ended. It almost ended in disaster. Really, I could have. They said if it was like just a little bit over, I would have lost my eye. They were saying like just like a centimeter the other way this way, I would have lost my eyeball. They were like you were very lucky. So, oh yeah. Yeah, it could have been. Yeah, that's what they said. Yeah, yeah, just silly. So I'm a little bit bruised. You guys can see I'm a bit bruised up through here. I'm bruised all over my arms, my rib cage, my back, my legs. They're all because I crushed as I fell. I landed on my heater and I crushed it because like I weigh like 80 kilos, so I just crushed it. It's flat. Looks like a tornado picked it up. So I'm bruised just about everywhere under this jumper. So oh well, things you do. If it doesn't kill you, you'll be fine. Sean says hard to back up these days. I'm getting old. Getting old. I don't have the balance I used to in my 30s. That's probably what it is. Getting old. Well, we'll get there. All right. All right. Let's run through this. This took me hours of editing because it's just so these people love to talk about their children and there was a lot of editing to do. So I had a ton of Yeah. I'll tell you more about that tomorrow. The they were, they're concerned, obviously. They were like, "Why is your eye split open?" So, it's okay. I told them already before I came in. So, yeah, I did most of the day. I have all my notes. I have about 90% of it. So you guys will get about 90%. Heal fast. Well, that's why the doctors didn't stitch it, because they were saying like it had already started healing really good, and they were surprised because they're like it only happened 12 hours ago, but they're like it's already seizing up and healing really good. So the doc's like, I don't want to stitch it and make more like wounds or whatever with the stitching, and he's like, I think it's going to be okay. So we'll see. I have a checkup next week where they're going to repackage all this and spray it full of that stuff again. He's like, this might, the nurse is like, this might sting a little. And she went, and I was like, oh, it really did. I don't know what they put in these little tape things, but they're like little spikes in it that kind of grab your skin. They're a bit spiky. They kind of hurt. Yeah, I got in a bar fight. The guy punched me in the face, split my eyebrow. Got in a fight with a great white shark. Yeah, like you didn't break a rib, you'd end up in the room next to Mrs. Ping. I know, right? So, it just seems like it comes in threes, eh? It's like everything. No, it's not staples. They're just like these little sticky pads, but they're like got little micro dermic grabby skin things in them. They kind of hurt when they put them on. No, no, tell it right. You saved the day, saved everyone from the evil television stand. That's what I did. Saved everyone in the world. Concussion will make you. I was already exhausted. I don't think the concussion would have changed much. I could barely keep my eyes open. I was walking around like not thinking. Like when you're so tired, you just stop making rational, coherent choices. I don't even know why I decided to put my pajamas on in the lounge room. I never do that. And then I was like, oh yeah, I'll just do it out here where there's heaps of sharp things and pointy edges. Could just go into the bedroom where there's a soft bed. See? Choices you make when you're tired. So you end up with this. All right. Temporary zipper. Yeah, that's what it is basically. So I got to go get it changed after on the long weekend. They want to have a look at it, and then they think it'll heal fine, but they're just like, if it's no good on Sunday, we might have to put a couple of stitches in. So I hope it heals because Ping does not like needles. I don't like needles. All right. We've got an absolute marathon of things to get through on this notes. I I mean, I don't mind doing like a 3-hour live show, but to do this like from start to finish, it would take me the entire day at court. So like about 7 hours because it's basically what was said in court. So to speak it back like they do, it's the same time frame. But I'll give you as much as I can. I'll give you as much as I can. So let me head back up here and then we'll get started. It's good to see you all, by the way. Good to see everyone. Let's go. Actually, there's a bit down here. Actually, yeah, let's start down here. There's a bit down here I want to talk about first because right before we got out of court for the day, there was something that I think we need to all talk about. So if I can get down to it. Sorry, my pages are like 70 pages long. What? My notes are 70 pages long. So hold on. All right. All right, we'll start here. So this was after our lunch break, and they said, Colomandy says to Erin, before lunch, we were discussing your foraging of mushrooms, and I think you said you found mushrooms that you identified as field mushrooms. And she says, yes. And then he goes, and there was another variety, question mark. And she says, horse mushrooms, so horse mushrooms. And Colin says, "You said that you went through a process of trying to work out what they were." And she says, "That's right." And he says, "But also, you were intending to eat them." And she says, "Correct." And Colin continues and says, "You told the jury the process you went through in order to do that." And he says, "You cut off a small piece, cook it in some butter, correct?" And she says, "Well, that wasn't the first thing I did. The first thing was reading on the Facebook group and thinking I had a really good handle of what it probably was, and then I'd give it a go." And they said this was found at her Shellcott property at the time. And she says, "That's right." And they say, "In terms of the meal that you cook for the lunch, um, which is the subject of this trial, do you accept that there must have been death cap mushrooms in that meal?" She says, "Yes, I do. Yes, I do." I can read that again for you. "Now, in terms of the meal that you cooked for lunch, which is the subject of this trial, do you accept that there must have been death cap mushrooms in that meal?" Erin's reply is, "Yes, I do." Colin continues and says, "Speaking globally, do you remember where the mushrooms that went into the meal came from?" So all of the mushrooms that went into the meal is what is what he's asking, and she says, "Right." So the vast majority came from a local Woolworths in Leongatha, and then she says there were some from a grocer in Melbourne. And then he asks her, "So there's been evidence that you told people you bought some mushrooms from an Asian grocer in April." And she says, "That's right." And he asks her, "Do you remember that event?" And uh, she says, "Not the specific purchase of those mushrooms. It's not clear." Colin asks her, "Are you clear about what occasion that may have been for or when it was?" And she says, "I know it was in the April school holidays. I think we went there for a week or two in the April school holidays, maybe only a week." And Colin asks her, "Had you purchased from these kind of shops before?" And she says, "I had, yeah." And Colin says, "What kind of mushrooms were you purchasing from these shops?" And she says, "Shiitake, porcini, and gnocchi was one of them. Sometimes the bags might say wild mushroom mix or forest mushrooms, like they wouldn't be specific about the type." Colin then continues and says, "There have been evidence that you bought a dehydrator in April of 2023." And she says, "I did do that." And Colin asks her, "Why did you do that?" And she says, "Well, I thought for a few reasons. I like eating wild mushrooms, but it's a very small season. You can't keep them too long in the fridge. So it was one way of preserving them and having them available later on throughout the year. But it wasn't just mushrooms. I thought perhaps I could use it to preserve a whole range of things." And Colin asks her, "And when you went foraging for mushrooms between 2020 and the middle of 2023, where did you go forage for mushrooms?" And Erin replies, "The Botanic Gardens in Currumbara." And then she says, "But also on my property on that Shellcott Road." They continue and say, "Did you dehydrate the mushrooms that you had foraged?" And she says, "I did." Colin says, "Do you remember when you did that after you purchased the dehydrator?" She says, "I did it quite soon, maybe within days." And he says, "Did you dehydrate other mushrooms as well?" She says, "I did, like Woolies mushrooms, lots and lots of them." And Colin asks her, "I think we showed you some photos before that were shared with your online friends." And they're asking about those photos of the mushrooms and the dehydrator and stuff like that. And they ask her, "What sort of mushrooms are this photo of the mushrooms in one of these photos she sent to the group chat." And she says, I'm pretty sure they were Woolies mushrooms, just your basic button mushrooms. And Colin says, on the post, it says, so fun fact, dehydrator reduces mushroom mass by 90%. And Colin asks, was that something you posted shortly after you bought the dehydrator? And she says, yes, I did. And he says, was that in the context of dehydrating these mushrooms? And she says, that's right. So, so they're asking about a different photo they showed to the jury of some mushrooms and the dehydrator. And they're asking her about this photo. And it's basically mushrooms on the dehydrator shelf. And she says, yes. And Colin says, so those mushrooms that we're looking at in this photo, perhaps I'll ask you this: where did they come from? And she says, I'm pretty sure I picked them from the Currumbara Gardens, Botanic Gardens. And Colin says they're not in great condition. She says, no, they're not looking good at all. And he asks her, "What did you do with them?" And she says, "So that was a bit of an experiment to see if they turned out okay being dehydrated whole like that rather than being sliced." And he asks her, "Did it turn out?" And she says, "No, not really." He asks her, "Well, what was wrong with them?" And she replies, "They were still a bit mushy inside, and their general condition didn't really help things too much. But yeah, they just didn't dry properly." And Colin says, "Well, did you try them?" And she says, "I don't think so. Maybe, but I don't think so." And then Colin says, "Well, why are they on the scales in the photo?" And she says, "So I was doing some experimenting around trying to find out what temperature to use, how long to put them in for. There was this ultimate proposition in my mind of being able to preserve properly." So she wanted to learn how to get the preservation done correctly. And she says, "This is where you get all the water out. So if you weigh them before and after, you know if you've got all the water out, and you know if you've done it for long enough." So I was trying to find out what those numbers were. Colin says, in the period that followed in May and June of 2023, were there other mushrooms, that is, wild mushrooms, that you picked on occasion? And she says, yes, there were. And they say, what kind of mushrooms were those? And she says, so I mainly picked field mushrooms like I had at my property, but there were some a couple of interesting ones at the gardens that I did pick if I saw them. And I believe I did do that in that time. And Colin asks her, do you know what those were, the mushrooms that you picked? And she says, yeah, I believe one type was called a slippery jack and another type was called a honey mushroom. And they said, did you try those? And she says, I did. And he says, well, what did they taste like? And she says, very nice. And Colin says, did you go through a process of attempting to identify those ones? And she says, yes, I did. And he says, how confident are you about them being called slippery jack and honey mushrooms? And she says, very confident. Interesting. There you go. Not interesting, I mean, there's your information that's has no descriptor ever. Here, I want to put up this banner so people don't. Why are we on this one? That's weird. Ah, sorry. We sometimes have to share resources, and the people from WebSleuth sometimes delete my stuff. So hold on. Not on purpose, I'm sure, but There we go. All right. So they ask her here, what kind of mushrooms did she have at her property in Leongatha? And she says, hold on, just let me double check something. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Just wanted to double check my sourcing. Yeah, it is Leongatha. And they say here, uh, they said by the time you're of April 2023, you were at your home in Leongatha. And she says, yes, that's correct. And they said, they ask her, did you find mushrooms in the paddock area outside of the back of that property? And she says, I did, yes. And they say, Colin asks, what kind of mushrooms were those? And she says, it was mainly field mushrooms again. There was another type up the back that were not field mushrooms, but I couldn't quite figure out what they were. So I didn't eat any of them. And he asks her, what about other locations where you found mushrooms? And she says, he continues, you have told us about Currumborough Botanical Gardens. And she says, yeah. Colin says, did you find any other mushrooms there apart from the ones you've told us about? And she says, apart from the three I told you about. And she goes, oh, wait. No, they actually had some other ones, the ones with the red on top with the white dots. There was lots of them growing. And Colin asked, did you pick those? And she said, no, I didn't. Colin asked her, and on these occasions when you went picking mushrooms, was there anyone with you? And she says, yeah, the kids were with me during the COVID period of lockdown. So in 2020 and in 2021. And Colin says, were they engaged in the process of picking mushrooms with you? And she says, yes and no. Like, generally, they just sort of ran around and did their own thing. But yeah, I mean, they definitely saw what I was doing. I think they even found a couple for me at one point. Yeah. Colin says, do you remember going to any locations with oak trees? And she says, I think there's some oak trees at the gardens. And he says, do you remember picking mushrooms in places near to or underneath oak trees? And she says, not underneath, I'm sure of it. It would have to, what did she say? Not underneath. I'm sure it would have been near because there's two or three in those gardens. Colin says, in the period of May of 2023, what did you do with the mushrooms that you picked from these locations? She says, I took them home, cleaned them, sliced them, and if I didn't think I wanted to use them that day, I would dry them and put them in the pantry. And he asks, where in the pantry would you put them? And she says, just in a Tupperware container on one of the shelves. And he asks, you have said that you bought some mushrooms from an Asian grocer in April. And he asks, was that when you were staying at Mount Waverley? And she says, correct. And he says, there's been some evidence about what you did with those mushrooms. What's your memory of what you did with those mushrooms? And she says, so the day I remember that I was going to use them, the day I bought them, but they were very pungent. I didn't think they would be a great smell for what I was making. So I put them in a container and put them in the pantry at that point. And he says, what happened to the container in the pantry? She says, I took that container back home to redacted when we went home. And he says, after April. And she says, correct. And Colin says, so you have mentioned putting some dehydrated mushrooms in a container in the pantry. Yes. She says, yes. And he says, was that at redacted? And she says, yes. And he says, you mentioned putting the Asian grocer mushrooms in a container. And she says, yes. A Tupperware container? Yes. He says, which also ended up at the same redacted. And she says, correct. He asks her, what was that container from Mount Waverley in your pantry at redacted when you dehydrated the mushrooms in May and June? She says, yes, it was. And the mushrooms that you dehydrated, you said you put them into a container. What container did you put them into?" And she says, "Well, generally, I will put them into a container that I already had sort of going with Woolworths mushrooms and whatnot in there. So I would just dry them, put them in a container, and if there was no container, I would start one, if that makes sense." And the last question of the day was, "Do you have a memory of putting wild mushrooms that you dehydrated in May or June of 2023 into a container which already contained other dried mushrooms?" And she said, "Yes, I did do that." And that was the mushroom, a lot of the mushroom details from today. I've got a little bit more that we can talk about. That was Let me find out if I can find out where we started. Nope, we're not doing that. Let me go back up. We had some more like, big breaks today. Big breaks. Why? I don't know. We just have them. Okay, maybe we can go back here. Uh-huh. All right. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the top of it. Okay. They ask her, Colin does, "Did you have an interest in wild mushrooms?" And she says, "Yeah, I did. Yeah." And he asks, "When did that start?" And she said, "It would have been early in 2020." And he says, "Well, why?" And she says, in what he says, "In what," sorry, this is Colin, "In what circumstances did you start being interested in wild mushrooms?" And her reply is, "So the first COVID lockdown, when you're allowed to go out for an hour a day, I would force the children to go out and get away from their devices for an hour. So we'd go to the Currumborough Gardens or the rail trail, and that's when I first noticed them popping up." And he says, "Was your interest drawn to them?" And she says, "Yeah, it was. There were lots of them at the gardens. I remember that." And Colin says, "What months are we talking about?" And she replies, it would have been the end of March, early April, somewhere around there." And Colin asks her, "Did the interest in mushrooms evolve?" Her reply is, "Firstly, perhaps." And he says here, he asks her, yeah, she goes, "Yeah." And then he says, "Had you always liked eating mushrooms?" And she says, "Yeah, I had." And he says, "Why?" And she says, "They taste good and they're very healthy." Colin asks her, "In terms of variety of mushrooms, did you eat different varieties?" And she says, "I did. I'd buy all different types from Woolworths that they would sell. I would get them, we'd have local farmers markets and I'd get different sorts from grocers up in Melbourne. I tried all of it." Colin says, "We have heard evidence about you saying that you bought some mushrooms from an Asian grocer." And she says, "I did." And he says, somewhere in Clayton, Oakley, Mount Waverley, etc. And she says, "Glen Waverley, yes." And he says, "How often did you do that kind of shopping?" And she says, "So the kids and I would go stay in Melbourne roughly every school holidays. So I would shop at the shops like when we were up there." And Colin says, "We've seen some images of the kinds of mushrooms that are sold in shops like that." And she says, "Yeah." And he says, "Did you buy those types of mushrooms?" And she says, "I did. Not those black ones. I wouldn't have bought ones like them, but the other ones, yes." And he asks her, "Well, how would you use them?" And she says, "I'd use them in curries or pasta dishes or soup, spaghetti, etc." And he says, "What did you like about the more exotic mushrooms?" And she says, they just taste more interesting. And he's like, what do you mean interesting? And she says, there's more flavor. And Colin says, you have talked about COVID and noticing wild mushrooms. And she says, yeah. He says, you said you first noticed them in the Currumbara Botanical Gardens. Is that right? And she says, that's right. He says, where else did you notice them? And she says, there were a lot of footpaths in Currumbara, and they also grew around a rail trail that goes to Loch, Currumbara, Leongatha, and beyond. And she says they would grow on either side of the trail. And he asks, you mean wild mushrooms generally? And she says, yeah, that's right. And also on the property that I was living on at the time. And he asks, what property was that? She says, the one in Currumbara. And he says, how big was that property? She says, 3 acres. And they said, when did you move there into that property? How old was your daughter? And she says, we moved there when my daughter was 3, I reckon, and my son was 8. So that's it. And they said, when did you move there? She says, sometime between 2017 and 2018, roughly. And he says, were you still living there in 2020? And she says, I was, we were, as in her and her children. He then asks, did you notice mushrooms on that property? She says, yeah, I did. Yep. And they said, what did you do when you noticed mushrooms? She says, I remember the first time I noticed them, I remember it was because the dog was eating some, and I picked all the mushrooms that I could see because I wanted to try and figure out what they were to see if that might be a problem for him, the dog. Colin says, as in whether or not they were toxic, and she says, yeah, that's right. Colin says, what did you discover about the mushrooms that were growing at that property? She says, I discovered it's hard to figure out what a mushroom is, except for some very obvious examples. But as far as I could see, they were ones that were potentially edible. But there was one species that I was a little bit worried about. Um, they said, did you identify it? She says, yeah, I believe they were called inocybe. I don't know what an inocybe is. Hold on, what is that? Oh, okay. It's called a fiber cap. Oh, okay. Oh, are these magic mushrooms? Is that what they are? Might be, some of them might be. These are the type of mushroom she is referring to. This is this is what I see when I Google that inocybe. So, and they ask her, how did you go about identifying them? And she says, there's Facebook groups for mushroom lovers. There's Facebook groups for everything, but where people share what they find and talk about the identity. I scrolled a lot of them. I think I also posted some of the photos that I'd taken to ask for feedback and opinions. And he says, once you started noticing mushrooms, did your interest in them increase? And she said, yeah, it did. Yeah. And they said, Colin asks, in terms of the ones that were found growing at that property, did you identify them? She says, I identified the ones that were growing in the paddocks where I had the animals. And she says, to a degree, I was confident. And Colin says, what did you think they were? And she says, they were field mushrooms and horse mushrooms in those paddocks. He asks her, did you consume them? She says, yeah, eventually I did, yes. And Colin asks, when you say eventually, what was the process? She says, I mean, it was a process over several months in the lead up to it. I got to a point where I was confident about what I thought they were. I cut a bit off of one of the mushrooms, fried it up with some butter, ate it, and then saw what happened. And Colin says, what happened? And she says, they tasted good and I didn't get sick. Colin says, thereafter, what did you do with the mushrooms that you found on the property? She says, So if I saw mushrooms, the same mushrooms growing, I would usually pick them and eat them and sometimes put them into meals that we all ate. And he says, what months did they grow in? She says, there were lots of them in autumn, tapering off a little bit to winter. So there you go. Colin says, you put them in meals we all ate. And she says, yeah. He says, does that mean you and the children? And she says, yeah. And then he says, did you put them in the children's meals? What did you do? And she says, I chopped them up very, very small so they couldn't pick them out. So there you go. There's the hold on, where's my thing? Here we go. Yeah, so there's the mushroom evidence from today. Sorry. Someone sent me a funny message. Someone sent me a very hilarious message, apparently. All right. Okay. Yeah, hey, good to see you, Carolina, Sean. Who else is here? Chipmunk is here, Julie Miller, Woman of Steel. Oh, damn it. Shouldn't have put that up. I don't know. That's speculation. Hold on. Mm, hmm. We might have to fix that. I might have to get rid of that. Taz says, I heard you on Web Sleuths today. Yeah. Hey, just another human. How are you? Good to see you. Warner Steel says, hi. Hi, everyone. How are you? Yeah. I think that's almost everything I wanted to get to about the mushrooms. Let me just double check. I'm just having a look through my notes, guys. Hold on. Yeah, I think that's about it for tonight. I think that's about what I wanted to cover. I thought that was going to take much longer due to the time frames in the court. I thought that was going to be a lot longer of an update. I gotta now. I now have to go back and blur all those comments that I brought up on the screen. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to click on people's names. So now I have to go back as soon as I finish this and go blur everything. Um, hmm. I'm just checking your comments, guys. I think that'll do it for today. I think that's really the bulk of it. There was a little bit earlier today that continued on about her and Simon's relationship and a lot to do with their children. It's I think I oh my god, why do I keep clicking them? Woman of Steel said, have they talked about the dehydrator yet? Yes. So you heard a little bit about it just before. We were talking about the dehydrator. So they ask her like, when did you buy it? Um, when you bought it, how long until you used it to dehydrate mushrooms? And she gave an example. So if you rewind through the video, you'll find it. You'll find it. Hey Jojo, how are you? Good to see you guys. Yeah, so I think it's gonna be a quick update tonight, guys. I am absolutely beat, and I'm still a little funny in the head from the knock to the head. So I think that was the majority of it. Yeah, see, there you go. You got to hear what we heard in court today. Besides a little bit at the beginning that was about the children. There was a bit about the children and some stuff between Simon and her and paying for things. But I think some of that evidence you may have heard already before on this channel. It's just being told from a slightly different point of view. So I don't think it would be something, you know, definitely get some rest. I don't know what rest is. I don't know what these ones are. These ones are the ones that are mentioned in the thing. Funny from the mushrooms on the screen. No, I didn't have any of those. Maybe I should have. Maybe that would have cured my head. I don't know what these are. They're called, what do they call them? Inoko or something. Wait, I'll look it up. What do they call them? Innercibe mushroom. I don't know what an innercibe is. It's a genus of mushroom-forming fungi with over 1,000 species. Its members are mycor mycorrhizal, and some evidence shows that the high degree of speciation is due to adaptation to different trees and possibly local habitats. Okay. Uh, what do they do? I don't know. There just seems to be a lot of them. It means apparently the Latin name means fibrous hat. So they have lots of fibrous hat apparently. I don't know what you do with them, but sure. Apparently, I looked it up. Some of these do have um, psilocybin in it. Not all of them, but some of them do. I don't know if that means, yeah, see? Psychoactive, 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 toxic, psychoactive, psychoactive. So some of them do have psilocybin in it. That's what makes it psychoactive. So some of them do have stuff in it. We'll see. All right, all right. What time is it? Hold on. Oh, it only took us like what? About 30-40 minutes to run through the majority of it. That was way faster than I thought. All right. Yeah, I'm going to get an early night. That's why I sort of jumped on early. I still wanted to bring you the updates from today, which we've done. And I will bring you more updates tomorrow. I'll be back in the courtroom for the entire day tomorrow. And now that I've got patched up and maybe get some sleep, and I'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow evening will probably be at 8:15. It probably will not be this early because I won't be home yet. So it'll be a later podcast tomorrow night because I got to go from court to the hospital, then home, then do my notes and then make the podcast. So takes a number of hours to do. So it'll be a little later tomorrow night. Okay. I love you all. Thank you to all the new subscribers. I really appreciate it. That number keeps ticking upwards, which I'm very thankful for because it just gives us more opportunities to do things. And I may have another trial coming for you. I may have one. I've applied to get into a different trial that's actually active right now. It started today. So keep an eye on that. And if I get in, I'll let you know. And I'll be producing more content on a different Australian trial. But there's some stuff to work out first. I have to see if I get into the like what happened in Melbourne. So we have to wait and see. Have to wait and see whether they let me have the information and stuff like that. We'll see. We'll see. But it is an interesting trial, the other one. The other one is the toolbox murders in Queensland. Now, I think we've done that story on this channel a couple of times. It is the man and the woman who were put in a toolbox and put into like a lake. They drilled holes in it and pushed it into a lake, and it sunk. And these people were drowned to death inside of this toolbox, like horrific death. And the people accused of that crime are currently on trial, and the trial started, I think, today. So we may be covering that one as well as the Erin Patterson trial in the coming days, weeks, whatever. So keep an eye out for that. And I'll be back tomorrow, hopefully feeling a little bit better and less bruised. Jeez, you can see how bruised up my cheekbone is. Look at that. Yeah. And I got to go feed my cats because they're going to eat me. They're going to eat me if I don't. I'll take care. I now got to go edit everything out that I accidentally put on the screen. So I got to go do that for like 40 minutes after I press that end button. But thank you very much. Thank you to all the supporters. I appreciate it. Sorry, it was a bit another quick day, even though it's a lot of information. We ran through it quite quickly. It was, a couple of hours worth of stuff like that. So hey, have a good night, everyone. I'm gonna get an early night tonight. I'll see you tomorrow, and yeah, love you all. Thanks for subscribing to the channel. And we'll get there. We'll get to the end. Eventually, we'll all get to the end together. Good night, everyone. See you later. Bye.